Hello there, everybody. And the coup that almost killed Putin. More rebellions coming. This is not the end. Damn, they almost got him? That's tough.
On Friday, the 23rd of June, something happened in Russia that shocked the entire world.
Министр
What
обороны
do I mean?
специально прибыл в Ростов для того, чтобы провести операцию по уничтожению ЧВК «Вагнер». Он использовал артиллеристов и пилотов вертолетов
Pilots flying
в
to
This
destroy.
is a criminal adventuristic campaign. It is equivalent to armed mutiny. Russia will defend itself.
A coup d'etat had started. The paramilitary leader of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, decided to invade Russian territory from Ukraine. Within hours of the attack, his heavily armed paramilitary had already captured the southern city of Rostov-on-Don. Without a lot of resistance, Prigozhin's army captured military facilities in the city, including the airfield there. One of the tanks that rolled into the streets of the city had Siberia written on it, meaning that Prigozhin intended to go for the entirety of Russia. His objective is to overthrow the current Russian regime. At least that is what Russian generals say. Putin accused Prigozhin, who was once one of his best allies, of treason and armed mutiny.
Oh, wow.
He went as far as to compare this new conflict inside of Russia to the Russian Civil War of a century ago. At the beginning of the conflict, we all thought the same. It could turn out to be a civil war between Putin and Prigozhin. We now know that Prigozhin backed off within 24 hours to avoid bloodshed. The leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, claimed he brokered a peace deal, which Prigozhin refuted. But what happened on that Friday was certainly a peculiar event, which drew the attention of all big media outlets. In this video, we'll go over how this was the first attempt to end Putin's regime. Now, coup and war and rebellion, all the words that YouTube algorithm is not a fan of, and this video is filled with these words. So please be sure to hit the like button below so YouTube doesn't throttle the reach of this video. We worked really hard to get this out as quickly as possible, and your like below can help out the video a lot. Just a few months ago, Prigozhin was called Putin's chef because his Wagner mercenary group was somewhat of a private army for Putin himself. For years, the Wagner group did what we call the dirty work in other countries like Syria, Libya, or Mali. In cases where the Russian army couldn't officially be militarily involved in these countries, the Wagner paramilitary offered Putin a helping hand. When Putin started his invasion in Ukraine, he needed every bit of help he could find. That's where he asked his former buddy Prigozhin for help. The Wagner group is widely seen as a professional army not to be messed with, and their military support has certainly helped Russia in the Ukrainian war. But now, exactly the opposite is true. In one Friday evening, the Wagner group became one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest threat that Putin has ever faced. A heavily armed, highly competent military one day decided to march through Russia, with the main objective being to bring down the current Russian government. What Prigozhin said in a video prior to the invasion tells a lot about how serious this was. All of us are ready to die, all 25,000, and then another 25,000. We are dying for the Russian people. After the invasion happened on that Friday evening, the Russian army took combat measures, moving troops and military vehicles on the streets of Moscow and many other Russian cities. That's how serious it was. Putin was scrambling to defend his own cities, fearing that Russians may soon be fighting Russians in a potential civil war. The events have luckily not escalated that much, but the coup that turned out not to be a coup will go down in history as the first attempt at fighting Putin's regime. Prigozhin's invasion of Russia was directly related to the war in Ukraine, and quite frankly, a very surprising plot twist in the conflict. However, it didn't come as a complete surprise. For many months, there's been a feud between the Wagner paramilitary group and the Russian army. Repeatedly, Prigozhin has accused the Russian government and defense minister of incompetence. Prigozhin was fighting in Ukraine as some sort of private army for Russia, but the cooperation between the Wagner group and the Russian army wasn't going smoothly at all. A month ago, the Wagner group retreated from Bakhmut, the city which they captured after months of deadly clashes. The reason for this was because they were running out of ammunition that Russia was supposed to supply to them. Prigozhin went on to post a video online, showing Wagner's casualties and personally blaming the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, for all these deaths. Prigozhin shouted at Shoigu asking where the ammunition was, something that damaged Shoigu's public image. Apparently, the Russian army wasn't able to supply their troops with enough ammunition to fight the war. According to the Wagner chief, though, the defense minister Shoigu didn't supply them with ammunition on purpose. He claimed that the Russian army wanted to weaken the Wagner group. Prigozhin retreated his troops, saying he needed to reorganize and restructure them for future tasks. We now know that this future task he had on his mind was in fact invading Russia, and that doesn't seem to be a task assigned to him by Putin. A while back, the first fights between the two parties had already happened. After Wagner retreated from Bakhmut, Russian forces allegedly attacked their fellow Wagner mercenaries. At least, that's what Prigozhin claims. Just before the Wagner group actually invaded on Friday, the feud between Prigozhin and Shoigu escalated even further. According to a video that Wagner posted on Telegram, Russian forces bombed a Wagner military camp just before Prigozhin invaded Russia. The Russian government had of course denied this, but the Wagner group was furious, saying that Russia betrayed them. Prigozhin said that he is a true patriot and that he will take revenge for this. The feud, which was once only a conflict in words between the Wagner group and the Russian military, had now escalated into an armed conflict. Prigozhin marched his troops into Russia in a day that will be remembered as a very peculiar one in Russian history. When Prigozhin started to move his troops into Russia, it seemed like he was actually trying to overthrow the Russian government. We were all curious about how this will affect Russia and whether Putin's regime will actually collapse. The chance that Prigozhin would be able to overthrow or significantly weaken Putin was absolutely there, but you need to consider that the Wagner army on its own wouldn't have
Hair feel like wet kelp? Switch to
I don't care about your hair, buddy.
been able to do the job. Prigozhin had about 50,000 soldiers in Ukraine, which were formerly fighting for Russia. Just a side note, 40,000 of those fighters came from Russian prisons, so we're dealing with tough guys here. But even if you have a lot of tough guys, 50,000 people is a small number if you want to topple Putin's regime. Compare that figure to Russia's total population of 143.4 million people, and it becomes clear that the Wagner group is a small minority in numbers. You can't conquer the biggest country on Earth with only 50,000 people, right?
That's true.
Putin, with a standing military of 1.15 million personnel and 2 million in reserves, seems to be in a comfortable lead. We shouldn't forget that Putin has deployed a lot of these Russian soldiers to Ukraine, so he won't be able to immediately bring them home to fight the Wagner group. But still, Putin has an advantage in numbers. At least that's what it seems like. So, why did Prigozhin even invade in the first place? It would be so foolish if he didn't have a plan. Surely the warlord thought that he had a chance. His first assumption was that most Russians would actually support him instead of Putin. In that scenario, the tables would have turned. It's not hard to imagine that some Russian soldiers would have refused to fight the Wagner group because they didn't want to fire on their fellow Russians. And it's not a far stretch to suggest that a lot of Russians like Prigozhin more than Putin. When we look at the internet searches of the Russian population, the trend is clear. Putin is no longer the most popular person in Russia. In the month of May, the Russians searched for Prigozhin's name twice as much as the name of Putin. And even though Putin controls all the media, Putin isn't nearly as popular as he was 2 years ago. Most Russians officially support the war when he looked at the polls. Some surveys show that 2/3 of the Russians support the war, or sorry not sorry, the special military operation. But this doesn't say much about the actual support for Putin. You see, the Russians that don't support the war won't admit it in polls, because it poses a risk to their livelihood when they openly criticize Putin's policies. And even when they believe Putin's propaganda and think the war is somehow necessary to protect Russia, most Russians aren't prepared to die for Putin.
You're like, yeah, we do not believe in this war. Bell shows up to your door next day.
War. When Putin drafted some 300,000 Russians to fight for the war, many Russians didn't like the way their country was governed anymore. Forbes reported some 700,000 Russians fleeing the country since the announcement, displaying large-scale discontent with Putin's partial mobilization. Even with the polls showing large levels of support for Russia's war, there are large groups of Russians who want the situation to change. In the Russian military, the same can be said. The British Defense Ministry reported that many of Russia's units in Ukraine were made up of poorly trained, mobilized reservists, reliant on antiquated equipment. There have been many reports of Russian soldiers being demoralized, treated poorly, and sent to the front lines without proper equipment. Numbers of Russian casualties vary, but some estimates are about 50,000 deaths and 180,000 wounded on the Russian side. Russian soldiers are having a bad time in Ukraine, and this will undoubtedly have an effect on their image of Putin. When you just lost your buddy in conflict, the chances are that you'll look at the special military operation a whole lot differently, especially when you didn't receive sufficient training and equipment beforehand. There are large groups of Russian soldiers that would have actually supported Prigozhin in his overthrow of power in Russia, because many of them share the same views as him. After all, they've experienced the incompetence of Russian military leadership firsthand, and indeed, many Russian soldiers have refused to fight the Wagner mercenaries. During the 24 hours of his invasion, Prigozhin has taken over Russia's army HQs without even firing a single shot. The soldiers in those HQs have directly disobeyed Putin by refusing to fight, because Putin ordered his army to take down the criminal Prigozhin. Because a lot of his soldiers were disobeying him, Putin having the upper hand in the situation was far from a certainty. However, it turned out that Putin had enough soldiers ready to fight for him to scare Prigozhin away. Prigozhin canceled his march on the Russian capital city to avoid bloodshed, meaning that he expected some resistance. This could have been a miscalculation on Wagner's side. They expected the vast majority of the Russian army to disobey Putin, and even some Russian soldiers joining their cause. Otherwise, you wouldn't attack an army of over 1 million men with just 50,000 people. Prigozhin probably also assumed that some of Putin's generals would turn against him, but within the 24 hours of his attack, this hasn't happened. But apart from the mutiny coming from the Russian forces, Prigozhin thought he had one more card up his sleeve. The threat for Putin came from the inside, but that doesn't mean that the outside won't interfere. We're talking about the Ukrainian war. Despite fighting against Ukraine himself, the Wagner chief might be closer to Ukraine than we thought. In the video Prigozhin posted on Telegram last Friday, he has criticized Russia for even starting the war in the first place. He said that the state propaganda, which is basically all that the Russians have been hearing on the news for the last months, is an outright lie. He said that the Russian Defense Ministry is trying to deceive society and the president. Prigozhin claimed that there was no crazy threat for Russia coming from Ukraine, and that the rumors of NATO trying to attack Russia were falsified. The paramilitary leader also said that there was no need to demilitarize or denazify Ukraine, and that these were all false theories. In other words, the Wagner chief defied all of Putin's motivations for starting the war. These reasons were countering NATO aggression, helping our Ukrainian brothers and sisters, and fighting the Nazis in Ukraine. Prigozhin's theory is that the special military operation was started for only one reason: to make the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, more powerful. Notice that the Wagner leader only criticized Sergei Shoigu, and he doesn't blame the Russian president himself. In Prigozhin's view, Putin doesn't hold the blame for believing that the war was necessary, because Shoigu and his people deceived him into believing it was. Prigozhin isn't trying to overthrow Putin, but he's trying to overthrow Sergei Shoigu. But this technicality didn't really matter in the conflict. Putin doesn't believe his former Wagner ally, because he continued to side with Shoigu. Putin did everything he could to stop Prigozhin's advances into Russian territory, putting up blockades and attacking Wagner columns. Quick side note, this is a very fast-moving story. By the time we're done editing this video, it's quite possible that a lot more stuff has happened.
Yeah,
so if you want to keep up with the
updates.
most up-to-date news, be sure to sign up for the newsletter down below. We'll send out an email at the end of every day covering the most important world news. It's completely free to sign up and is one of the best ways to keep up with geopolitics news. But the essence of this story does matter. Prigozhin didn't believe the Ukraine war was necessary. He had said on camera that Ukraine was invaded under false pretenses. Obviously, this fact gave him some potential allies. Some other countries liked the fact that there was turmoil within Russian borders. The Ukrainian government had loved to replace Putin with someone a little more positive towards them. Someone who wouldn't attack their country for no apparent reason. Maybe, Prigozhin would have been a better leader for Russia than Putin in Ukraine's eyes. Of course, it's choosing between two criminals for Ukraine. Prigozhin has often been described as a gangster, as he started his career in the St. Petersburg Mafia. Ideally, Ukraine wouldn't like Putin nor Prigozhin to be in power in Moscow. The Wagner Group has been accused of several war crimes, for example, in countries like Mali, where they've operated previously, and more recently, the paramilitary has also committed atrocities in Ukraine, for example, targeting Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. But if there's any prospect of Prigozhin ending the war, it might have been in Ukraine's interest to help him. When Putin stays in power, Ukraine might be in for a long and costly war that will cause a lot of casualties and destruction. It will cost a lot of military equipment and soldiers to retake former Ukrainian territories. Sending support to Prigozhin as some sort of ally against the Russian army might have more return on investment, and Ukraine's allies, such as the members of the NATO alliance, have also weighed their options. The US has said that the Wagner coup is real and serious, and President Biden is consulting his allies on what to do next. Many Western leaders have repeatedly said that they don't like Putin. The question is whether they liked the criminal Prigozhin more than Putin, because he could stop the war in Ukraine. So when Prigozhin attacked Russia with only 50,000 people, a part of his reasoning could have been that other countries would support him. Ukraine, who already is at war with Putin, could have helped Prigozhin. Not that Ukraine is friends with Wagner in any way, but the enemies of your enemies are your friends, right? And NATO could have also decided to support the uprising against Putin. However, sending weapons directly to Wagner would have been a dangerous move, because, well, nuclear bombs.
Yeah.
When there is a direct threat to Russia's existence, Putin has the right to push on the red button, if you know what we mean. It's worth mentioning that, unlike the US, Putin needs his central military command, the General Staff, to confirm a nuclear attack. Because launching nuclear weapons indirectly kills most of Russia's population due to retaliatory strikes, the General Staff won't follow Putin's orders blindly. But the United States will likely not risk it and send direct military support to the Wagner Group. But sending secret support, who knows? Because Prigozhin could have gotten support from both the inside and also the outside. He probably thought that he had a real chance against Putin. And yes, we know, Prigozhin wasn't going after Putin's life, but if the situation spiraled into a civil war, which it could have, according to Putin himself, Prigozhin would need to fight Putin to the end. Prigozhin definitely wanted to change the Russian government, who he views as incompetent. Putin didn't allow this to happen, so it was one or the other. Prigozhin came really close, and with that we mean really close to Moscow, in what Wagner called the March for Justice. He tried to march from Ukraine to the Kremlin, taking with him thousands of his mercenaries. His men came as close to 200 kilometers from the capital city, passing through cities like Voronezh. The main road which the Wagner Group used during its March for Justice was the M4 highway. This is a 1,500-plus kilometer highway connecting Rostov-on-Don with Moscow. Rostov-on-Don was the first city which the Wagner Group captured, after which they advanced northwards. But after the first skirmishes, with helicopters attacking Wagner convoys on the M4 highway, Prigozhin changed his mind. North of the Wagner convoys, Russian crews were tearing up the M4 highways to slow Wagner's advance. At this point, Prigozhin hadn't yet received the help he hoped for from the Russian military or outside. There have been no reports yet of Russian generals helping Prigozhin with his mutiny, and neither Ukraine nor NATO offered support for his coup. When Prigozhin realized this, he turned around to avoid Russian bloodshed. Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, said he made a deal with Prigozhin, but the Wagner chief has denied that this has happened, as he turned around for other reasons. The fact that this coup wasn't going according to Prigozhin's plan can be one of these reasons, but that's just an interpretation. At the end of the 24-hour period, Prigozhin ordered his troops to retreat to their Ukrainian camps. At the time of writing this video, it is unclear what Prigozhin's plan is exactly. One thing is for sure, and that is that his friendship with Putin has ended. Putin denounced the Wagner-led armed rebellion, and he will likely try to attack Wagner as a punishment for them attempting a coup. And the fact that Prigozhin retreated doesn't mean that the coup d'etat is completely over. You know,
Just means it's put
Prigozhin is
on
going
hold.
to go back to Ukraine for a reason, as he doesn't just go to some remote part of Russia. Ukrainian troops probably won't attack Wagner mercenaries after they have tried to attack the Russian army. It will be in Ukraine's benefit when Putin loses his grip on power. Maybe the Wagner Group is going back to prepare for yet another take at the capital. This time, having more support from both the citizens inside of Russia and possibly even from other countries like Ukraine. Talking about Ukraine, Kiev is really the biggest beneficiary of all that has happened in these 24 hours. Obviously, Putin prioritizes his position as the Russian president over winning the war in Ukraine. When he has to choose between fighting Prigozhin or Ukraine, he'll likely choose to fight Prigozhin. The Wagner mercenaries have directly threatened Putin's leadership in Russia, and they still do if they're able to attack again. Right now, Putin has a lot of his soldiers deployed in Ukraine. This is a crucial moment in the 16-month war, as Russia is now holding off a new Ukrainian offensive. Some Ukrainian commanders claim that the main offensive group isn't yet deployed, meaning that the situation will only get worse for Putin in the coming weeks. The games that Prigozhin is playing in Russia serve only as a distraction for Putin. The Russian president will have a hard time defending against two attacks at once, potentially coming both from inside and outside the country. To increase his odds, Putin needs to decrease his efforts in the war in Ukraine and focus on keeping his grip on power at home. This means that Putin could move his troops away from Ukraine, and that the Ukrainians will have less of a hard time recapturing their territory. Even when he's not ready to give up on Ukraine, the president will at least focus less of his military capabilities on the war happening outside of Russia. It will be hard for Putin to fight against the Wagner Group, just with his police force. Remember, the Wagner Group was coming to Moscow with tanks and heavy weaponry. For his special military operation, Putin has deployed much of his military equipment in Ukraine, but it now seems like he has to move at least some of his back into Russia, because there is the new threat of the Wagner Group trying to overthrow the Russian government. This is good news for Ukraine, because it gives their forces a window of time to execute their previously planned offensive. On the day of the attempted coup, Ukraine has already made several advances along the front lines. What Prigozhin has done in Russia may be a turning point for the war in Ukraine, and if his plans are to go for a next coup attempt, Friday the 23rd of June also may be a turning point in Russian history. What happened on this day will go down in history books as the first attempt to end Putin's regime. If you want more news on this story, check out the second channel, Basics Daily. Over there, we are publishing a video every few hours covering the latest development in this story. Just yesterday, the team there published 5 videos about Prigozhin actions, so if you're not subscribed, you're definitely missing out.
That's crazy though. Bro was banking on a lot of stuff for it to go through. Never let a good crisis go to waste. You know, remember a New York coup attempt that lasted 24 hours and no one really fought or killed or was killed. We all watched how easy it was for Wagner to sees something strange going down here. Bro doesn't want more people dying, I guess. I don't know. He doesn't want his men dying and the other men. I feel like he's trying to portray, like, I want to change the power, like the head of the power, so then we don't keep doing this war that's causing so many deaths. But I want to do it by you guys surrendering to us and us not taking you guys' lives for it and making everything worse. Because if he went in there and just started killing people, then it's not helping his case, right? They're going to be like, oh, he's another power-hungry person who's trying to seize power by force. But he's trying to use media and whatnot and trying to, you get what I'm trying to say, right, though? I feel like that makes sense. He's trying to make it so, like, oh, I'm not trying to start a war. I'm not trying to do nothing. I want you guys to surrender to me so then we could fight him together and take him off his power, take him away from his power and where he feels safe. But yeah, on that, let me know you guys' opinion. Like, subscribe. See you guys later. Hope you have a good day or night, and bye.